Oh, oh God. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Gabester here. This is the normal raid guide for Kor'kron Dark Shaman. As usual, click on the annotations just for the quick raid guide or the tank healer DPS or even the mumble fight. So let's get started. For your raid composition, you'll need 2 tanks, standard there, and 2 or 3 healers. Although in this case, I would recommend 3 healers, especially if you're just progressing or learning this fight. The 3rd healer will offer a lot of stability in a fight where the DPS requirement is not that severe. There's a lot of stuff going on here, a lot of position shenanigans and issues, and it's kind of hectic. So a 3rd healer will increase your survivability and just offer that stability that might help you out. It's also briefly worth noting, I usually don't talk about DPS in the composition section, but in this fight in particular, melee DPS are not going to be able to help you with one of the bosses entirely. So they do share health, but the Wavebinder summons a series of adds very frequently, and because of the damage that these adds deal around them, melee just really cannot engage them at all. So for that reason, unfortunately, ranged DPS are quite a bit better on this fight. But just do what you have and adjust accordingly. So when you initially pull these for the first time in the week, the bosses will be back in their hut, just hanging out there. So you'll have to have your tanks pull them outside to you, or maybe hunt or misdirect, something like that. However, once you've engaged once, they'll hang out outside here waiting for you. Now, the dogs that these guys are riding will engage as well. So your tanks will need to split the bosses, one on each tank, but the dogs can be attacked by or tanked by whomever. However, your DPS should focus on getting the dogs down first before the bosses reach 85%, because at 85%, the special abilities start to be used, the totem abilities for these shaman. So you want to make sure the dogs are killed by the time that starts up. So the main mechanic here in this fight is, since both of these guys are shamans, they use totems. And the type of totems they drop will increase as their health goes down. So at the very beginning, they don't drop any totems until they reach 85%. At that point, they'll drop the Poison Mist totem, which grants each of them 1 unique ability. Then they'll drop Foul Stream totems at 65% health and below. And finally, at 50% health and below, they'll drop their Ash Flare totems as well. So by the 50% mark, they will have 3 different unique abilities each, which means that the last half of the fight, of course, is a lot more chaotic than early on. So Earthbreaker Haromm is the easier of the 2 shamans, so we'll cover him first. The first totem ability that he gains is Toxic Mist, and this is a dot placed on 2 random raid members. It lasts 30 seconds, and for the duration, those players will take heavy nature damage every 3 seconds. It starts at 80,000 per tick, but it increases by 10% every time it ticks. So by the end, it will be around 100% more, or around 160,000 damage for the last few ticks. So best thing to do is to have players that are afflicted either receive extra heals from your healers during the last 10 or seconds or so, or just have the player use a personal cooldown at the end of the duration as well. And other than that, you can't avoid it, so just heal through the damage. The next ability is Foul Stream, and this is used at 65% health and below. When this targets a random raid member, that player should immediately move to the side of Haromm. So there you can see I'm targeted. It's very obvious who's targeted by it. You have about 3 or 4 seconds before a line of foul toxicity will shoot out from the boss toward the player's location. So that's why the player needs to move to the side. This will force the line from the boss to only hit the player that's targeted and not really force anyone else in the raid to move from the center. It does always hit the player that's hit. That's about 300,000 damage initially, but that should be the only player that is hit by that thing. So again, just move to the side of the boss. There was another great position, getting him just off to the side of the Haromm, so no one else is in danger of having to move at all. And then the final thing for Earthbreaker Haromm is the 50% health totem, which gives him Ashen Wall. So if you look in the bottom right, well, it's gone now, unfortunately, but I'll turn my camera in a second here. You'll see a wall of ash elementals. There they are on the top left slightly. Basically, the wall is summoned pretty close to the Earthbreaker himself, pretty much within melee range of him. And these elementals just stay stationary unless a player walks within melee range of them, and then the elementals will attack them. So this basically is just a form of controlling the space in the room. And when there's plenty of those effects, and this is just one more of them. So there you can see another wall was created. We didn't actually get enough attempts in to figure out the angle that the elementals spawn at. So I'm sure that would be something that you could figure out and then keep the facing for Haromm appropriate so that the angle of that wall doesn't push out into the center of the room like that second wall is for us. Rather, it should hug the wall of the side of the room that you're going along, ideally anyway. So those are all Earthbreaker's abilities. They're all very basic, really pretty simple to deal with. The only one that requires moving him is the third one at 50%, but that should only be a slight adjustment, whatever is necessary for getting out of the melee range of those walls. So let's move on to the more challenging boss, which is Wavebinder. So Wavebinder Kardris is by far the most dangerous boss in this fight, and her first ability at 85% is Toxic Storm. Now this creates a cloud with a 9-yard radius at the location of a random raid member. It seems that this has a sort of maximum or preferred maximum targeting range, so it won't target players that are all the way across the room. It seems to target players that are nearer to Wavebinder when she casts it. So you can somewhat control where it pops up in that regard. That said, the Toxic Storm does huge nature damage, about 300,000 to anyone that gets hit by it. But more importantly, perhaps it creates toxic tornadoes, which will spin around the room and are just generally annoying, as well as doing, again, really heavy damage if you get touched by them. So both of these abilities are great methods for these mobs to control space. Once again, this entire fight really revolves around controlling the space and the area you're given within this room, because it's a very strange shape and configuration, and you got all these cubbies and whatnot. So anyway, Toxic Storm is quite deadly, and you can see it there on the screen with the tornadoes popping out. The next ability she gains is Foul Geyser at 65%. And this is probably the most important ability in terms of dealing with it properly. Basically, she will spawn a series of small little oozes or slimes at the location of players within melee range of her. So generally, because you probably won't want your melee DPS to be attacking her because of this ability, this means that these will spawn at the location of the tank, and the stream will just continue to spawn. So there you saw it kind of a moment ago. She was just streaming those slimes over and over in little volleys at the location of our monk tank, who was moving away so that the slimes, when they land and spawn, wouldn't be right next to him. He'd be moving away slightly. Now, once the slimes appear, they're going to do massive damage to anyone that's near them. Basically, if you are within 3 yards or so of a slime, you'll take 100,000 damage per second per slime. And there are 16, I want to say, something like that. I believe that's correct. It's every half second they spawn over 8 seconds. So the key here is handling these slimes in an efficient manner without really getting anyone in melee range. Obviously, players that have an immunity or massive damage reduction, 90% plus, could technically get in melee range for a moment, but it's not advisable. So for that reason, the best way we found to handle them is once they spawn, again, they should shoot after our tank for the most part, even though right here they are. Oh yeah, they are. He just was moving over to the other boss at the time. It's very chaotic. Anyway, so the best thing we found to do was to have the tank move in a small circle around the boss as they're spawning so that the initial spawns don't hit him or her. And once they're active, then the ranged DPS can AA them down. It also helps if your tank has some form of threat that they can use at range, or simply drop something on the ground that will pick them up as they appear. So you can use a keg throw for a monk tank, or consecrate, or death and decay for death knight or paladin, all that kind of stuff. But the goal is to try to keep everyone out of melee range of the slimes and then kill them off quickly in a group. If you let them split up as they're spawning and run all which way, that's going to be bad times for everybody. Now, Wavebinder's final ability at 50% health and below is actually the easiest one to deal with, at least in my opinion. It's called Falling Ash, and essentially she will spawn a huge red circle. There you can see it on the ground on the left, very obvious. And after a few seconds, a bolt of ash will land on there and deal pretty massive damage to anyone that's still in it. So there you can see it landing. It takes a long time for that to actually come down. Now, if you're inside it, you'll take about 1 million damage. Bummer. But if you're outside, you take 300,000 fire damage. So it's a pretty massive hit to the entire raid. For that reason, you can use minor raid cooldowns or personal cooldowns when it's about to hit, just to help your healers out a little bit. Otherwise, your healers just need to concentrate on keeping everyone topped off when they see that red circle active. You have, again, a long time before the bolt comes down. You can even see it drop if you watch closely. Right in the back there, here it comes. Boom. So, yeah, you have plenty of warning. So it's just important to make sure that there aren't any players in the raid that are, teetering on half health or below, something like that. So that's it. Really, those are all the abilities. So now let's get into actually, positioning the mobs a little bit, how you handle transitioning, and talking about tanking as well, because there's some important aspects there. Now, a lot of the difficulty in this fight revolves around the movement patterns of the bosses and the positioning of your raid members relative to them. And this is probably the main thing to consider when you figure out your tanking assignments and then your movement patterns as well. Now, I apologize for not having a lot of insight into this because this is normal difficulty and our group is extremely overgeared for this content. We don't get a lot of chances to really experiment or try things, whereas in, heroic in the future, everything will be nailed down and practiced and all that stuff. So I'll have a lot more concrete information about what works best and what we tried and didn't work very well and all that stuff. So that said, this is our second attempt that you're seeing in the video here. So really things are very chaotic in terms of our movement and positioning. And, next week we'll try some other things. That said, what you see here, it worked, but again, it was not pretty. Basically, what we tried to do is keep the bosses somewhat separated, only moving them together when tank swaps had to occur, because the boss Haromm will use a stacking debuff that increases the damage he deals from Frost Storm on that tank. So eventually that tank will have to swap with the other one. For that reason, and because things were so chaotic for a kill, I think next week we will try keeping the bosses together, and thus allowing tank swaps to be much easier. The thinking was that we didn't want our melee DPS to have to deal with the slimes, so we were able to keep our melee DPS on Haromm here. But especially if your raid group has very little or no melee DPS, then I would strongly suggest trying to keep the bosses together. And that way, the only people that have to worry about slime spawns are really your tanks at that point. And even then, melee DPS can obviously just run away for a little bit. The slime will target one of your melee in particular and sort of aim toward them as they're spawning. So that player can also move away from the rest of the group while those are popping up. The last thing you could even do is watch the cooldown of the foul slime, and just before it's about to come out, have someone interrupt Wavebinder, have the tank interrupt her, move her away a few yards, and then you can guarantee that the slimes are not near Haromm, and that way your melee DPS can attack Haromm even during the slime period for a brief moment. So those are all things I would suggest to try, but basically they revolve around the idea of keeping the bosses close together so that your tanks can swap easily, and more importantly, so you have easier kite paths. So with the bosses together, you would kite around the outside of the room, essentially, moving every time either a foul storm forced you to do so, or an ashen wall did force you to move. The good news is that both of those abilities have a 1 minute duration from when they spawn. That particular instance will despawn after a minute. So if you take up, pretty much this full room as your kite path and only move when those abilities force you to, you'll easily have enough space, no matter how long it takes you, to loop back around, because the spawns behind you will have disappeared by then. So again, these are all just my suggestions after our attempts and examining things and how it went. But your mileage may vary. So from there, that covers all the abilities, and the last thing is really just deciding when you want to do a burn. Once the bosses reach 50% health, there is no additional damage or soft and rage mechanic or anything like that. It does not get any more difficult after that 50% period. So basically you can use your cooldowns when it best suits your raid after that marker, bloodlust and all that stuff. You also may even want to time it such that you can get the bosses close together if they're not already after a slime period has just ended. And that'll give you a good 30 seconds or so in which to use most of your bloodlust while cleaving the bosses down if they're not tanked near each other already. So I think that covers everything. It's a pretty chaotic fight, but again, if you get the positioning and the movement patterns down, it should come together pretty quickly. That is the Kor'kron Dark Shaman Normal Raid Guide. As always, good luck, and thanks for watching.